Hello, and welcome to Season 11, Episode 6 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I am Mark Bishop.
We are, of course, reading J.R.R. Tolkien's The Monsters and the Critics and other essays, this time reading the essay on English and Welsh, which you, I guess, didn't find as interesting as some of the others because you literally fell asleep in the middle of reading it. I thought it was interesting. There's definitely some interesting points that he makes in here.
Well, my defense, I did put the book down
before
I fell asleep. But I was in my recliner, my comfortable recliner, in my little cave in the basement, and I put it aside, and I promptly fell asleep and started snoring. Yeah, I mean, I have a number of notes that I have a number of question marks in the margins, which I intend to ask about because this was pretty technical.
Yeah, a lot of it was, but I mean,
and by that I mean he's really getting into linguistics.
Yes,
in earnest.
Yes, or philology, as he really calls it. I don't think he uses the word linguistics.
He does not.
Not once.
Yeah,
it's philology all throughout. Because
Yes.
Really more on the history of the languages, and really the main point of this essay is encouraging English researchers to focus more on the Celtic languages, to consider Welsh and British and all these other things that have had influence on the English language. I would say that's his main thesis throughout.
Very good.
I thought you would have some insights to that.
I'm a little distracted because when I look into your eyes, the computer screen is reflecting off of the glasses. So all I can see is you look like a cyborg.
Is that better?
Like the bad guys from the Battlestar Galactica TV show, except for they had little red lights that would go track
I've
back
never
and forth.
seen the Battlestar Galactica TV
but
show.
yours weren't red, nor were they tracking back and forth. But
you were just seeing the line from the
It was
computer.
almost,
Yes. Right.
You're very electronic appearing.
Are you better now?
Yes, now I can see you. Gaze into your eyes.
Well, there you go.
Yes. So, and I mean, obviously I read it, and it was I don't mean to say it wasn't interesting, but it wasn't like fun. And so, it's a little bit harder reading for me because if you're not interested in something you're reading, you gotta have to, work at it just to get through it.
Yes.
But what were your thoughts?
I enjoyed it. I mean, a lot of the middle section I thought was absolutely very technical, like you said. But the stuff in the beginning, especially when he was talking about race and language and things like that, I thought that was really interesting. And then later on, his conclusions at the end, I think, are also very good. But yeah, he says at the beginning, he kind of just lays out his main point. He says, I would say to the English philologists that those who have no first-hand acquaintance with Welsh and its philology lack an experience necessary to their business, as necessary, if not so obviously and immediately useful, as a knowledge of Norse or French. So, of course, Norse and French kind of held to high standards as things you should study for studying English. Welsh and the other Celtic languages, not so much, even though they've had a lot of direct, connection with English throughout the history of the English language. So that's a good point. And that's sort of his main thesis throughout, and he's trying to prove that you should study Welsh if you're going to study English.
Yes. And he talks about, was a gentleman by the name of Joseph Wright. Mm-hmm. Do you know who that person is?
I don't know I know the name vaguely, but I do like how he says it was characteristic of him that this advice was given in the form, go in for the Celtic lad, there's money in it. Yeah. And he says, well, of course there wasn't any money in studying Celtic. That's ridiculous. I thought that was an interesting sort of aside that there would ever be any money in studying any language, which there usually isn't.
Correct. Did you recognize any of these other names he mentions?
Yes, a few of them, yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so like this John Fraser's...
I did not know
He says John Fraser's maximum, which says a little Welsh is a dangerous thing, which I thought was kind of clever, but I'm not sure what it means. So is Welsh... Do people speak Welsh?
Yes, Welsh is still alive. It's not by very many people, but it's spoken in Wales, part of the United Kingdom, sort of the western edge of the UK there before you go over into Ireland.
Can we use them as like code talkers in the next great war?
Maybe. It's a weird language. It's very hard, notoriously hard to learn for people. Well, especially with the orthography. I don't know if you saw any of the spellings of the Welsh words throughout. Yes, very strange orthography. And the Celtic languages are just kind of difficult for people who speak the Germanic languages to learn generally. But yeah, I mean, he goes into a little bit of the history there. But I mean, of course, all of Britain in what is now the UK was spoken was populated by Celtic speakers before you have Latin influence. Caesar made it up into England, into Britannia, and then the Jutes, or what are now called the Jutes, or the Saxons.
You're supposed to call them that.
Well, yes, you've made that exact joke before the podcast. Brought the Germanic over and created what was English in like the 400s AD.
Okay.
So you have Germanic influence, but it was originally Celtic. Before you have outsiders coming in and bringing Latin or Germanic languages.
Interesting.
Yes. You don't seem very
No, I am. I thought it was good.
Yes. But I like the story.
So he does mention that on page 163 that Welsh is at least still a spoken language.
Yes.
So I have a question mark whether it still was
Yes,
with even a small number of people.
And you still have like Irish spoken, Scottish Gaelic are still spoken, but very, very few people. But I mean, there have been concerted efforts to try and bring them back. How successful they are, how successful they'll be, it's kind of uncertain.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's a Duolingo Welsh course and Scottish Gaelic, and I think Irish as well. So it's there's stuff out there so you can learn them.
Like the most impractical of all foreign languages.
Yeah, probably. But
because it's not like you're going to go, I need to learn that because I'm going to go on vacation
to Wales.
And I want to be able to speak the native language.
Yes.
Because even the natives don't speak it. Really.
Generally speaking. I mean, there's very few.
Well, I think he even mentions about conquered peoples and all that. And of course, the King of England trying to wipe out the Welsh language, their separate identity. He mentions that in this chapter.
I like the story he tells about St. Peter kicking all the Welsh out of heaven.
Yes.
I guess it's some old joke. He says, unless the story is to be credited, which I first met in the pages of Andrew Board, physician of Henry VIII, that tells how the language of heaven was changed, St. Peter, instructed to find a cure for the din and chatter which disturbed the celestial mansions, went outside the gates and cried "Caus Bobi," which I think means cheese outside, and slammed the gates to again before the Welshmen that had surged out discovered that this was a trap without cheese. There's too much Welsh being spoken in heaven, so he kicked them all out, and Welsh now is an earthly language, as the story goes.
So was that story? I kind of missed the punchline. Is that because the Welsh are so good that they were overpopulated?
I think it's because the language is so weird that it doesn't sound like a language from Earth.
Cacophonous.
Yes, that was kicked out of heaven and so weird.
Because it was so odd.
Yes, so he kicked all the Welsh speakers out of heaven. Yes.
Interesting.
But yeah, he says that there was a lot of specific oppression of the Welsh language throughout a lot of the English history,
including Henry VIII's Act for certain ordinances in the King's Majesty's Dominion and Principality of Wales.
Yes.
Laid down that all ancient Welsh laws and customs at variance with English laws should be held void in courts of justice, and all legal proceedings must be conducted in English. Mm-hmm. The last and most oppressive rule was maintained until recent times, 1830.
Yeah.
Which makes sense because you kind of want everything in the one common tongue.
That is true.
Like how we should have everything in America.
And in English?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, American.
Yeah. American specifically.
Yes.
But no, I mean, that is a thing that does cause languages to die. That's just kind of seen throughout world histories. If you have a more powerful, government sort of saying, okay, well, everything's going to be conducted in this, then generally speaking, the language that's not, the language of government is more likely to die out because parents see it more profitable to teach their children the language that's used in government and school and things like that.
Yes, you'll at least be bilingual because you have to conduct business.
Right, exactly. And then once you become bilingual, a lot of those bilingual speakers don't pass on the older language or the more local language onto their children because it's just not useful. That's just what's seen, kind of across the board.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that is very interesting.
That's how you can kill a language. I guess that's why English is so common across the world, is because the British colonies and
now American influence over the past 100 years.
A lot of French too, for the same reason. I guess Portuguese would be in some countries, but not as much. Maybe Dutch.
Spanish is
a big one.
With all of Latin America, really. Anything south of the United States.
Except for, isn't Brazil Portuguese?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, which is a big country, I think.
Yes, very big. I mean, there's more Portuguese speakers in Brazil than there are in Portugal. Yes. And same thing for Spanish. There's more Spanish speakers in a lot of the Latin American countries than there are in Spain. Yeah. So it's kind of weird with those languages that, there's more speakers there than in their home countries. And I'm sure there's more English speakers in the U.S. than there are in the UK. Yeah, just by population. Yeah.
Yes, correct.
Thank you. But then he goes into this discussion, after he talks about sort of the uniformity and things like that. where he says, languages are the chief distinguishing marks of peoples. This is on 166.
Where you at? Oh, 166. Yes, because
Yes,
I enjoyed that part of it.
After the Icelandic quotation there.
Yes.
It says, no people, in fact, comes into being until it speaks a language of its own. Let the languages perish and the peoples perish too, or become different peoples. But that never happens except as the result of oppression and distress. So he's quoting this Icelander of the early 19th century, Sierra Thomas Samuelsson, when he's talking about specifically Icelandic, which is a very interesting language because it preserves a lot of the Old Norse constructions in the language because it's such an isolated island out there in the middle of nowhere, really.
You kind of skipped over, which I don't usually like to go back.
Oh, please.
But the end of the previous paragraph, where he says, language is the prime you didn't read this, do you? The prime differentiator of peoples, not of races, he has quotes. Whatever that much misused word may mean in the long blended history of Western Europe. I think that is really true, and I wish we could have a better understanding. It kind of flows into the more recent arguments about, our divisions in our country are not based upon race. Really, it's about culture.
Yeah.
And what he's talking about is something more broad than any of that, which is language really is a differentiator between peoples rather than, some concept of race.
Yes, and I think that's very true. And he says even before that, he says, for though cultural and other traditions may accompany a difference of language, they are chiefly maintained and preserved by language. So all of those cultural things are very much tied into the language as well.
Well, and it really, like in current affairs, if you look at the war in Ukraine, a lot of that had to do with that there was, of course, they were imported during the Soviet Union, but a lot of Russian speakers in certain areas, in the Crimea, and in a couple regional areas that were vast majority Russian speakers rather than Ukrainian. I'm not a real expert on any of that stuff, but I think that certainly played into the history of the conflict and certainly Russia's purported justification for invasions in whichever years, 14 and 18.
14, something like that.
And it was one before Trump for sure, and then one after Trump during Biden. But I think there were three. There was one during Bush.
2014, definitely.
Yeah, there was one in 8, which was which is the seizure of the Crimean Peninsula. That was under Bush, right?
Or was that in 14? I thought it was in 14.
14 would be Obama, wouldn't it?
Yes. I thought the Crimean Peninsula was taken in 14. I could be wrong. I'm not an expert on.
I think you might be wrong.
Okay.
Because
I can look it up as you're talking.
There's Crimea, and then there was the provinces in the Donbass. I think that was during Obama, and then the full-on invasion of. Anyway, it's kind of academic. You can look up the right answer, but my point is that that kind of proves Tolkien's point with regard to what makes up a people. Even
2014 was Crimea. 2018 was the Donbass. Yeah.
Sorry, I was thinking 8, but I was.
And then 2022 is the more large scale invasion that's still going on.
But I got the right order.
Yes, I think so. Yes, Crimea, then Donbass, then the current.
14. Okay.
Anyway, that's a side note.
So who was president in 14?
That was Obama.
That was Obama.
Yes, because he was 8 to 16.
And then who was?
There's Trump in 16 to 20.
But their invasion wasn't during Trump.
I was just looking at Wikipedia.
No.
In 2018, Ukraine declared the region to be occupied by Russia in the Donbass.
Yeah, that's not right, because that's not an invasion.
I see.
They didn't have. I mean, they had like an ongoing hostility during Trump's first term, where Trump was providing them with munitions. I thought there was an incursion during Bush, but I guess maybe I'm misremembering.
You might be right. Okay, well, the Crimea and the invasion of the Donbass happened at the same time, the same year. It says here on Wikipedia, 2014 to 2022 is the Donbass. 2014 was the annexation of Crimea.
Annexation, already invasion.
What?
The invasion occurred. The seizure of Crimea occurred before they formally annexed it.
I see.
So that was just a fait. It's saying it's a fait accompli.
Right.
So there was.
So that would have happened under Bush, and then Obama was Donbass.
So I was closer.
Yes.
I was closer.
You're right.
But anyway, it's kind of irrelevant to the point I was making, which is the point that Tolkien was reiterating his point, which is that the community's language really is more indicative of them being a people than any sort of racial characteristics.
Yeah. And you see people really try and have their own language, like even when there really isn't a distinction. You see that in some of the like the Balkan states. I forget which exact languages it is, but there's a few that are essentially the exact same language. They're just called a different thing once you're in the borders of a different country. They say, well, no,
is there like an accent?
There's some minor differences, and there've become more differences since they've decided like this is a separate thing. Yeah. But when they first decided, okay, no, this is this language, this is this language, there was no difference between the two.
Oh,
like none at all. Well, one they might have been orthography. So one was written like in Latin script, one was written in Cyrillic. And so then they decided, well, no, these are two separate languages, but it's the exact same thing. Same thing happened like on the borders of India and Pakistan. Where you have the same language spoken on either side. One's written in like a Hindi script, one's written in like the Arabic script. And those are decided to be different languages, and they're sort of claimed as two different things, even though the structure of the language, the words are the exact same. But of course, once you sort of decide this is this language, you're going to have more regional differences with the orthography and things like that if it's two separate systems.
But the actual verbal, what it sounds like would be...
Yes, they could understand each other, 100% the same.
Interesting. I was not even familiar with this concept.
You have the opposite problem with a lot of dialects or really languages that are called Chinese. They're written the same way, but they pronounce the words completely differently, and it's like a completely different thing. So they wouldn't understand each other spoken, but they could write the same way, and they'd understand each other. So it's like saying that there's a Chinese language isn't really correct. What you usually refer to as Chinese is Mandarin Chinese, but then there's a lot of other Chineses within that whole group of Chinese. Yeah,
fascinating.
Yes,
it's kind of like hillbillies. What? Like or somebody that is from Louisiana. Their accent is they're speaking the same language. Like on Waterboy. The one guy, It was just a
lot of times it's even more so than that, where it's just like entirely different languages. It's not even an accent thing.
I was trying to bring it back to something topical that maybe a listener might know.
Of course, yes.
But yeah, go ahead. Right. Well, like if you have a really, really thick accent,
right? You're
speaking the same language, but you might not understand it, which I know is not exactly the point you were making.
Yes,
you're making a more esoteric point and had more meaning.
Yes,
I heard thunder.
So did I. I hope that isn't picked up on the mics.
It's going to storm.
But then he goes and he talks about, he says, we're dealing with events that are primarily a struggle between languages. He's saying that very specifically, right? We're talking about the contact between the English and the Welsh language, not necessarily the people, although those things are kind of intertwined. But my main focus is the English and the Welsh language.
Yes, there's a long discussion of that. Maybe you can share with us your thoughts, because I'm just... kind of at a loss as to... I mean, I understood what he's saying, but Well,
there's some really interesting stuff in here. He talks about the distinction between, like, how do you decide who is of a certain group of people when you're looking at the past? Because he says, like, well, we can see, like, elements of, like, Welsh names that have been, like, transliterated into, like, English sort of systems. Can we say definitively that English person's talking about a Welsh person? Right? So it's, like, kind of a tricky area. Because it's, well, maybe this English person just had a Welsh name. Can we say that the name is indicative of who the person is? And he talks about that for a good little bit there, about how you adopt different names. But he says, he says, so it was again when new invaders came to Britain. He's talking now about Danish. He said, in later time, it cannot be assumed that a man who bore a Danish name was in whole or part of Scandinavian blood or language, or even of Danish sympathies. He says, Ulfketil is as Norse a name as Caedwalla is British, yet it was borne by a most valiant opponent of the Danes, the alderman of East Anglia, of whom it was recorded that the Danes themselves said that no man on Anglechina had ever done them more damage in fighting. He says, like, you have this guy with a Danish name, but he is very, very English. So if you're looking at these historical records, you can't just say, okay, Welsh name or, Scottish name, therefore that's a Welshman, that's a Scot. It was very hard to do that. I thought that was very interesting.
It was interesting from a study of linguistics.
I thought so, yes.
Point of view.
You didn't think so?
Yeah. I mean, it's a subject I'm just not really that interested in.
Right.
And so I should apologize for that. I mean, I'm not denigrating it.
Well, he also makes a really interesting, I think this is more a historical point. This is at the bottom of 171.
Yes.
He says, in that case, they are and were not either Celts or Teutons, according to the modern myth that still holds such an attraction for many minds. In this legend, Celts and Teutons are primeval and immutable creatures like a Triceratops and a Stegosaurus, bigger than a rhinoceros, more pugnacious, as popular paleontologists depict them, fixed not only in shape, but in innate and mutual hostility, and endowed even in the midst of antiquity, as ever since, with the peculiarities of mind and temper which can still be observed in the Irish or the Welsh on the one hand and the English on the other. So he's essentially warning a lot as he's talking about looking in the past of you're trying to apply these concepts that we have now and these very distinct peoples that we have now and saying, okay, well, people were exactly the same back then. I think you see that a lot in history, especially in a lot of like social issues where it's like, look, this thing that we really want to promote and celebrate right now, this has been happening for 2,000 years because clearly nothing has changed and these people act the exact same way they did 2,000 years ago.
Right.
You see this a lot with like race discussions with like classical studies, where it's like you have people where it's like, oh, look, this person was from Africa, therefore you had like a black emperor. Okay, well, Africa and black are not synonymous. We kind of think about them in somewhat of a similar way now, but it's like you're trying to apply this group as if it's the thing that it is now and trying to just backtrack it onto history when that's just not a thing you can do. He's saying the same thing with the Celtic people as opposed to like the Germanic people. You can't just say, okay, we have these ideas of them now. We can't just say, okay, well, they were the exact same 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, because like the North Africans, a lot of them could be Greek. Of Greek descent, after or Roman after those, they're Mediterranean or north of the Sahara were a lot different than sub-Saharan Africa. I guess because of the desert.
Yeah, that would do it. That's a big dividing line throughout the whole continent.
It's almost more of a dividing line than an ocean of water.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Because you can more easily. Well, yeah, certainly the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean was so navigable. It's like a pond in a way. I mean, I'm not trying to minimize it. But anyway, so, he mentions here, right before that quote, on 171, he says, the eradication of pre-Indo-European language is interesting, even if its cause or causes remain uncertain. So he's talking about like the more primitive languages pre-Welsh? Is that what he's saying? Okay.
So Proto-Indo-European is what it's now called. We don't have like any records of this. It's a reconstructed like hypothetical language that's just seen by like observing the similarities and common patterns that develop as languages change and become new languages. You can kind of backtrack those and form a proto-language. So for just about all of the languages in Europe, with some weird exceptions like Basque and like Finnish and Hungarian, which I think I've talked about those before, and also a lot of the others that cross like through the Middle East into like North India, those are all part of the Indo-European family. And so there's a hypothetical Proto-Indo-European that was the original language and that split off as the people spread through different parts and became different languages. So like our language is like English is more closely related to Hindi than it is to Finnish, even though English and Finnish are both from more or less the same continent. That's wild. Because Finnish is from a completely different language family, the Finno-Ugric language family.
Fascinating.
So that's what he's talking about there, is the Proto-Indo-European, what he calls a pre-Indo-European language.
Got it.
So we don't really know how or what exact point in time. There's kind of hypotheses of when a certain language could have existed to give it enough time for it to develop into all of these different things, something like 10,000 years ago or something like that. But
so we're talking about primarily an unwritten language.
Yes, there's no written anything in this language.
That's why you don't know what it is.
Yeah, so it's entirely reconstructed.
Yeah, so it'd be like the base language and then...
and then everything else
splintered off and then eventually are written down and developed.
Right, exactly. And so that's sort of how we explain why certain languages are more related to other languages, because they're on branches. Languages are usually like a family tree.
Right.
Is how you often represent them. So we're like in the Germanic branch, so we're more closely related to German and Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish than we are to Latin, but we are still related to Latin along that tree somewhere.
So if this were the Joe Rogan podcast, this is where he'd segue into. That's probably what the language of the aliens gave us.
Yes, then probably.
And then it developed into the Romance language.
Yes, it's now raining. I hope this is being picked up by
There's a lot of thunder and raining and lightning. There's a reference to beer.
To beer?
Yeah, did you see that?
That's in the drink?
Yes, the beer. It says right on 172. I have it underlined.
Oh, please.
Celt full of vague and misty imaginations, and the Saxon solid and practical, and not under the influence of beer. Unlike most myths, he's talking about the different types of people. Right. So I just thought I underlined the beer. It was a continuation of the quote that you just read a minute ago.
He's saying we now think of like the Germanic people as these sort of solid, serious people.
When not drunk.
Yes, exactly. When they're drunk, it's a different story. But yeah, he then talks about what are we really talking about when we're talking about sort of the Celtic versus the British here, or the versus the English? And he says there's really a very, very long history that's been neglected. And he goes through this in some detail.
He did not neglect it in this essay. And was this a lecture?
This was a lecture.
Wow, listen to that.
There we go. We're getting a storm warning. We're now continuing with tornado sirens going off in the background because talking about English and Welsh is more important than going in the basement with the tornado warning. So hopefully those sirens.
This will be our last episode before we're both killed as we're podcasting.
We're actively recording
on the second story bedroom of our house, instead of going to the basement. Mm-hmm. It does, in our defense, the warning is saying the tornado is coming directly over our heads.
So it's not a problem.
So we're just going to, well, in my real defense, these sirens are going off like once a month for the last 4 months.
That's true.
And nothing ever happens. So
are you talking about the warning?
the sirens. The sirens.
They test them every first.
No, not that one. That's at noon.
But anyway, we were talking about
a clear day.
Yes, he says there's a very long history, and I won't go into all of the details here. But he says, there's.
Oh, please go into all the details.
No, I said I'm not going to go into all the details, especially not as the sirens are going off in the background. Right. But he says English and British were far centered in history and in structure, if less so in the Department of Phonetics than in morphology. Borrowing words between the two would have presented in many cases small difficulty, but learning the other speech as a language would mean adventuring into an alien country with few familiar paths, as it still does. So referencing just how difficult it is to learn these Celtic languages, and he's using British as an example of one such Celtic language there.
What page were you on?
I was on 179.
Oh, you're even past where I was. I had a whole bunch of notes here.
No, well, please ask me about the notes there.
He mentions the pre-Roman languages of Gaul have, for all practical purposes, disastrously perished. Is that proto...
So, no, those would have been, he's talking about the Celtic languages. So in France, before you had Latin come in, French is a language derived from Latin. You would have likely had Celtic speakers in all of France. Yeah. With some like Basque. Basque is another one of those weird languages, which we're not sure where it came from. Yeah. But yeah, it would have been the Gaelic, the Gauls, which would have been Celts.
Isn't it funny how what we commonly think of as Celtic is Irish,
right?
But it really is like French.
Yes, so the Celts probably also originated on the continent,
yeah,
and then made it over to the British Isles. Yes. So even they were newcomers into the land. But I don't think we think that there were any. Well, maybe there were people before them, but we don't know what language they would have spoken before the Celts came over, and then the English and everything.
Probably a bunch of pops and whistles.
Yeah. I don't think so. I think that's really unlikely, actually.
I don't know.
Most likely not.
Something like that.
Exactly.
All right, so you were on 179. So
yes.
where are we at next?
I was going to jump ahead to 181, where he talks about this word Waelstad. I thought this was really interesting because
what?
Waelstad, Wealhstod. Yes. And he says that this is a word that was really used. It's the Anglo-Saxon word for an interpreter. So we're talking about Old English here. And you see this come up quite a few times. And he says it's really coming from the word for whale, where we get Wales, Welsh, that Wales, Waelstad. So someone who speaks Welsh. And so you have this system of interpreters. He says it's really interesting to find this word used. And it's used like as a baptismal name, so it was used as like an occupation. So we have some idea that there was, some intermingling between the peoples. There was a conversation. You would expect that. But for it to be a fully formed like occupational name is really interesting. Yes. You have this word specifically for someone who can talk to the Welsh people, and that's where you get this word coming from. Like it was such a feat and such a job that you had someone who spoke Welsh, and that was his job, was to speak Welsh and to interpret the Welsh into the English. Yeah. And he says it's also interesting that you. Then you start to see the term British used. And so this is where you even asked me about this.
Yes.
Like we kind of confuse the two terms, British and English. Now we sort of treat them interchangeably. But he says in the life of, Felix of Crowland's Life of St. Guthlac. So this is, again, another very old English thing. But he says this is probably due partly to the Latin from Britannia, with British getting there. But Britas and the adjective British continue to be used throughout the Old English period as equivalents of Waelas, Wallace, or Waelish, that is, of modern Welsh, though it also included Cornish. Sometimes the two terms were combined in Breitwalas and Breitwelish. So you have really British as a Celtic name, and then over time you start to see it being used for just generally like the great British people, the people of Great Britain. And this is another point I think he makes where he says, trying to apply the modern ideas back in the past. He says the modern Englishman finds this very confusing. At the bottom of 182, he has long read of British prowess in battle, and especially of British stubbornness in defeat in many imperial wars. So when he hears of Britons stubbornly, as is to be expected, opposing the landing of Julius Caesar of Aulus Claudius, he is apt to suppose that the English, who meekly put themselves down as British in hotel registers, were already there, facing the first of their long series of glorious defeats, a supposition far from uncommon even among those who offer themselves for honors in the school of English. So he says, like, even the English now sort of retcon themselves into British history, where it's like the English, properly speaking, wouldn't have come into England until the 400s with the Germanic language. It was really the British people, the Celtic people, who were holding off Julius Caesar in some regard. But it's easy for the modern English people to now say, well, that was us.
Yes,
not necessarily. It was really the Celtic people.
I guess it depends on how you consider it your inheritance.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So if you're really part of that country, part of that people, and now of course a lot of the Celtic people and the Germanic people are just the English people now in the UK.
Yeah, so back to his argument about what makes a people.
Yeah, it's more so the language.
But I guess they didn't speak English.
That's true. They would not have spoken English. They would have spoken Welsh or British or something.
It's kind of funny. They conquered them, and then they're like, oh, yeah, we were one of you guys.
Yeah.
But no, you weren't.
And then he does make an interesting distinction where he goes on to talk about the Greek barbaros. And I think I've mentioned this before. This is on 183, where he's talking again about that word whale with the whale stod. He says the word was not applied to foreigners of Germanic speech. So it was specifically for the Celtic people, where you have that combined with the British there. Is therefore basically a word of linguistic import, and in itself implied in its users more linguistic curiosity and discrimination than the simple stupidity of the Greek barbaros. And he's referencing there, the ancient Greeks had this word where we get the word barbarian and also the word Berber for the Berber people of North Africa. Anyone who didn't speak Greek was seen as a different race of person, essentially.
Yeah.
And the Greeks, interestingly, really didn't care too much about learning other languages. You don't really have a lot of ancient Greek grammarians, except looking at Greek itself. And so they say, well, those are barbarians because they say bar, 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 bar. And that's all we hear when we think of them. They are the people who say bar, bar, bar. Yeah. And that's just applied literally to everybody who did not speak Greek.
Yeah.
And so then it's
very chauvinistic. I kind of like it.
Yeah. And then it's really only when you have the Latin, the later Latin connection with Greek and the need to translate between the two that you start to have Latin grammarians starting to examine other languages because you have to teach Latin school children Greek so they can read Plato and all these other Athenian playwrights and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very interesting distinction that, sort of the old English people had a better distinction of different groups of people based on language than the Greeks did.
Yeah.
Which you would assume the Greeks would have a lot of that because they were surrounded by so many different languages. Even the Egyptian to the south of them and all of the Middle Eastern languages to the east
Persians
and things like that.
And all that.
They really didn't. It was all just barbaros to them. Of course, they recognized different languages, but they didn't really study them because everybody else was a barbarian, more or less.
And I'm sure they were bilingual Greeks.
Yes, of course. But it just wasn't a key area of study for them as it was for other people.
Yes.
Yes, but then he continues on, really just a lot of this sort of discussion of these different roots and things like that. I don't think it's really too necessary for me to talk about all of these, although I think it is very interesting.
I think it's a great essay for somebody who studies that,
yes.
And well written and all that kind of stuff, and not difficult to read if you have some knowledge of the subject and a lot of interest in it.
Right.
But
and then he gets on towards the end.
Very detailed. Where are you at?
Yes, I'm going to go on to 189, 190, where he talks about starts talking about just the beauty of things. He says, I've talked about all these technical reasons, right? I've given you reasons why Welsh has impacted English structure, and you can look at the history of English with help from Welsh. But he also says, well, it's just beautiful.
Yes.
He says, I will now attempt to say now what I mean by calling a language as a whole beautiful, nor in what ways Welsh seems to me beautiful, for the mere recording of a personal and, if you will, subjective perception of strong aesthetic pleasure in contact with Welsh heard or read is sufficient for my conclusion. He says, I just like listening to it.
Yeah.
It's a really neat language to listen to, and if that doesn't give you a reason to study it, I really don't know what will.
Yeah.
It's just a very nice language. But then he says, if I were to say language is related to our total psychophysical makeup, I might seem to announce a truism and priggish modern jargon. I will at any rate say that language, and more so as expression than as communication, is a natural product of our humanity, but is therefore also a product of our individuality. We each have our own personal linguistic potential. We each have a native language. But that is not the language that we speak, our cradle tongue, the first learned. Linguistically, we all wear ready-made clothes, and our native language comes seldom to expression, save perhaps by pulling at the ready-made till it sits a little easier. But though it may be buried, it is never wholly extinguished, and contact with other languages may stir it deeply. I thought that was a really interesting point. He's essentially saying that you have a native language like innate within you, and it might not be the language you learned as a child. Because he says that was really Welsh to me. I would see Welsh going by like on the names of passing like railroad cars, and I would just see that, and there's something like instinctual in me, like I want to learn that. He says that's somewhat of my native language, not in the same way as my firstborn language, my mother tongue. But.
It's a very similar attitude as the trans people have.
Yeah, I guess
I was born in the wrong language.
So.
That's what Tolkien's saying. I was born
the wrong language. That's really funny.
Yeah, a little Tolkien humor there.
Yeah, that's
I really enjoyed his description starting in 191 about the various. He was talking about the cradle. The cradle English tongue was cradle tongue was English. And he says with a dash of Afrikaans. So it was.
He was born in South Africa. He was born in Bloemfontein, South Africa. He only spent a few years there before his family moved back to England. But
and then his second language was Latin, and then French, then Greek, then Spanish, and then he talks about Gothic.
Yeah,
is that a language?
Gothic is a language. It is an East Germanic language that's now no longer spoken. But it's when you hear about the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths. Those were Wow, that was a big thunder that probably came through. Those were probably a Germanic people that we now have, later records of a Gothic language that I think died out in like the 800s, 900s, something like that.
Interesting.
But it was over like in Eastern Europe where there were Germanic people.
And now the Gothic architecture and stuff. So I knew there was the Goths and all that stuff.
But that was a language. I think some of the only surviving sources we have are like the Bible translated into Gothic, as far as I know. I know the Lord's Prayer is in Gothic, but very few examples of Gothic. But that's one of them. But I thought that was interesting too. He says, Gothic was the first to take me by storm, to move my heart. This was the first of the old Germanic languages that I ever met. I have since mourned the loss of Gothic literature. I did not then. He says, the more I learn about it, really, the more I miss it, even though I never really had anything from it.
Yes.
It's just sort of it's really coming down now.
Well, it might be hail.
Oh, good.
As they say, looks like hail outside.
Yeah, it does. It sure does. I also like his point that he makes on 190. He says, most English-speaking people, for instance, will admit that cellar door is beautiful, especially if disassociated from its sense and from its spelling. More beautiful than, say, sky, and far more beautiful than beautiful. He says, well, in Welsh, there were just a lot of cellar doors, right? Just things that sound very pretty, things that just sound very interesting, even, regardless of the meaning. Like a cellar door is a really basic thing. But I think he's right, cellar door, that sounds nice. Something about it's more beautiful than beautiful.
Yeah. Well, and I think of course, it may be just because of the World War II movies I've watched, but I feel like German is really an ugly language, like very angry.
Yes.
But it's not. I think a lot of people think that.
Yeah.
And then like the Asian languages sound so foreign.
Yeah.
Obviously they're foreign to me.
Yes, of course.
But it's just a different, almost like a rougher language, or I don't know, just say strident.
Yes.
So I understand what he's saying there. All right, what else do you want to say? There's a Welsh poem of 194, which I could not read, although it does say amen.
There you go.
Yeah, I did see that. Is this glory? I don't know. But I don't know if there's something else you want to mention before that.
Well, I was going to look back at what I had here. But he says...
Well, I have a final quote that I want to say.
Please.
But I don't want to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
On 194 towards the end, he says, for many of us, it rings a bell, or rather it stirs deep harp strings in our linguistic nature. In other words, for satisfaction and therefore for delight, and not for imperial policy, we are still, quote, British at heart. It is the native language to which, in unexplored desire, we would still go home. I thought that was really neat.
Yeah, I thought that was really neat. But he says, I really like this interesting little point he makes here. As I have said, these tastes and predilections which are revealed to us in contact with languages not learned in infancy, O felix peccatum Babel, which is O happy sin of Babel, are certainly significant, an aspect in linguistic terms of our individual natures. Since these are largely historical products, the predilections may be so too. My pleasure in the Welsh linguistic style, though it may have an individual coloring, would not therefore be expected to be peculiar to myself among the English. It is not. It is present in many of them. He says many English people feel the same way. Right? There's something about us that we like the Welsh. We want to learn this language. It's a beautiful language. There's just something innate in us about it. And I just really like that idea of the happy sin of Babel. That you have, of course, in the Bible, the description of the Tower of Babel causing the split between languages, and it was really a punishment. But now we kind of see it a little bit as a blessing and something that's part of our human nature, part of who we are as people. Our identities are very much wrapped up in the language and everything like that. So I thought it was very interesting.
Yes. It was a good essay.
Good. I'm glad you thought so.
Yes.
Worth staying up and reading all the way through.
I got back up and finished it out. There's a midsection which we kind of skipped over, which
is very much just in the details of what the Welsh language is.
It seemed like to me that he had a lecture where he had an introduction talking about more the philosophy of studying language, and then he had a lecture about the specific importance of Welsh as it relates to the English language and history of languages in that context, and at the end about his love of language.
Right.
So I really enjoyed the first
and the third.
Fell asleep during the second, the mid, and then I really enjoyed the
that's
last.
Good. I think he really does make some interesting points about how language, is part of who we are as people, and that's something that comes up time and time again in all of his writings. That was his big thing was making these languages, and then you need people to speak those languages, and that's where the whole stories come from. So I thought it was really interesting to see that written here.
Yeah, he makes some good points. Things I never would have considered before about what makes up a people.
And it's not things that I don't think linguists consider anymore, really, which is a shame.
Well, you say that, but you're a linguist.
That's true.
You think it, so
that's true.
So you'll carry the day.
Well, there we go.
Eventually, those people will die.
that's very true, I guess.
So the next generation starts with you.
That's true.
And so if through this very influential podcast, you'll be able to get a following.
Yes, of course.
First, there'll be a cult following.
Yes.
Of linguists and philologists. In their youth, they'll be coming out of grade school and high school wanting to be a philologist.
Yes, because there's so many young children who
and they'll follow in your footsteps, and you'll bring back the renaissance of the study of language.
We can hope.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really kind of mean that in a way because, you don't think about it now, but now I'm over the hump of my career, and so you can see where you could have had influences on people as they came up, or you can still. You don't really think about that when you're in your 20s,
right?
But if you're really active and you're vibrant and you speak a certain amount of truth, especially in your field, because you're going to publish stuff at some point, I think you could really be very influential and bring about a complete change in the field of study. God knows a lot of them are going to get fired in the next 5 years because they run out of money. Yeah. So you fire them, and then you just retain a core group of people that actually care about the subject.
Yeah, very true.
I'm a believer in it.
Yes, that's an uplifting note as the tornado seems to have passed us by completely. It's not even raining anymore. It doesn't.
Well, that's the calm right before the hits.
Oh, yeah. Right in the eye of it.
Wait, do I hear a train? That sounds like a train. Famous last words in the Midwest.
Yes. Well, the next essay will be more about language. The next one's A Secret Vice.
What is the secret vice? Don't tell me. No, tell me.
It's making languages. So he gave this essay about his secret vice, his secret bad habit was making up languages. That's not a thing that people really generally do in their free time.
Who has the mental strength? Like the athleticism. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it takes a certain amount of mental energy to be able to do something like that over the long term, in addition to your regular work and writing and teaching or whatever he was doing.
He referenced a couple times. I don't know if you noticed, but this I think was delivered in 1955. So this is right before The Lord of the Rings was published.
Yeah.
And he's like,
he referenced it a couple times. In the notes he does.
But he's like, a few times he's like, I have this massive project I've been working on. I've been delaying because it took him like 20 years to write The Lord of the Rings alone, like 15 years. So it's like, even as he's giving this lecture, he's like, I have other things I need to be doing right now as I'm preparing to publish The Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
And that was like his lifelong problems. He kept just trying to perfect things throughout his whole life, and he would never really decided on anything fully before he died with a lot of his writings, which is a shame. But he just kept working on these things. It was literally a lifelong project for him.
Yeah. Good deal.
Very interesting. All right. Well, do you have any other final thoughts for this
episode?
I do
not.
All right. Well, this has been Season 11, Episode 6 of Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop, even after the storm.
Even after
I'm
the
here,
storm.
I survived.
Yes. Good job. And you can, of course, follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions.